Renata, you're not on the agenda, Gerald Breckett said, looking at his clipboard the way people look at clipboards when they've already made a decision and don't want to argue about it. I was 47 years old. I'd been working at Piedmont Healthcare System for the last 12 years as a supply chain administrator. And I knew exactly what happens when someone in authority tells you your presence is procedural instead of material. They think you'll sit down. I walked to the lectern. The notebook was a green composition book from Dollar General, the kind you could buy in a pack of 3 for $6.99. I'd had it since April of 2021. 3 years of case numbers and dates and inspector names recorded in blue ballpoint on lined pages. The spine cracked from being carried in a tote bag with grocery receipts and work memos, and the manual for the lawnmower I'd bought to maintain the yard myself. I set it on the lectern and opened it to the page with the date I was looking for. Chairman Breckett, I said. I filed my nomination paperwork with the Cobb County HOA registry at 9:02 a.m. on October 3rd. The deadline was October 4th. I got it in. I paused. In that room of 83 residents sitting in folding chairs, arranged in 5 neat rows facing a table where Gerald and 3 other board members were looking at me with varying degrees of discomfort. The people who knew what was coming were already reading ahead. And I want these residents to see what I've been keeping track of. 22 code enforcement complaints have been filed against my property. 4 Birchwood Court, 22 complaints, and not a single violation found. Not one. Every single one of them was dismissed. Same person filed them all. Same neighbor. And the thing about keeping a record like this, I held the notebook up so the room could see the worn cover, the pen marks on the back where I'd clipped it into my bag. Is that it's not just a list, it's a pattern. In the second row, a woman in a yellow cardigan leaned sideways toward her husband and said something I couldn't hear from where I stood. 3 or 4 other people shifted simultaneously in their seats. That particular movement people make when they've just recognized something. I saw it happen in real time. The moment they understood that the handwriting on the pages I'd photocopied and distributed door to door the week before. The same pages now sitting on their kitchen tables, next to their coffee makers or their mail piles or under the magnetized notepad by the phone, was the same handwriting they were looking at right now. I believe you deserve to see this record before you cast a vote for the board. I said, I believe you deserve to know who has been filing these complaints and what he's been complaining about. I've got the documentation right here. Gerald opened his mouth. I kept going. A mailbox post, a driveway, hang-in planters, a raised garden bed I built over Labor Day weekend. That one just came in September 9th. Case CE 2024. 0189. Code enforcement officer measured everything, found nothing wrong. Every single time, found nothing. Every single time, dismissed. The room wasn't loud. That's what I remember most clearly. The room had gone quiet, in a very specific way. And not silence, but the quality of air when people who are usually comfortable in their own space have just realized something is not proceeding the way they expected it would. Gerald's pencil was still in his hand. His mouth was still slightly open. Somewhere in the back, a folding chair creaked, and it sounded like someone shifting their weight the way people do when they're about to make a decision. I set the notebook down and let that sit for a moment. No grand pause, no drama. Just the ordinary silence of a room paying attention. "Let me back up," I said. And this is when I turned and looked directly at the people sitting in those folding chairs. Not at Gerald, not at the board members trying to make sense of what was happening, but at the residents. "Let me tell you how we got here. My name is Renata Moss. I'm 47 years old. I bought the house at 4 Birchwood Court 6 years ago, June of 2018. It took me 7 years of saving to be able to do that. 7 years of budgeting and disciplining myself and not taking vacations because I wanted to own something. Own it outright on the back end of one refinance, not rent, not apologize for being there. I could feel the shift in the room. Not a dramatic turn. Not what the people making dramatic television would call a moment, but a recalibration. The specific tensile strength of a space where people are beginning to wonder if they know who they're actually looking at. For 6 years, I've kept this house, maintained it, paid my HOA dues on January 1st, every single year by automatic transfer, $1,800 per year, without exception. And in that same 6 years, this notebook filled up, not from violations, not from anything the county actually found wrong, from complaints. And I'm going to read you all 22 of them right now, because my neighbor wants to tell a story about standards and what keeps this neighborhood safe. And I think you should hear the other story, the one that's in writing, with names and dates and case numbers and dismissal letters. I opened the notebook to the first page. The handwriting was even careful. The kind of handwriting you use when you're trying not to cry, but you're also trying to make sure the record is clear. Case number CE 2021 0047. The date was April 14th, 2021. The inspector's name was Terrell Bird. The outcome was dismissed. The note I'd written that evening, the one I'd barely remembered putting there until I was photocopying pages and saw it again. Fence posts in spec. Apologized with his eyes. I read it out loud. Not dramatically. Just the facts. The way you'd read a receipt. May 3rd. Case CE 2021 0058. Mailbox post. Inspector's name Marcus Chen. Dismissed. I turned the page. June 22nd. Case CE 2021 0087. Driveway pressure washing. Inspector Leah Washington. Dismissed. I could hear someone in the third row breathing differently. The woman in the yellow cardigan had unfolded the photocopy in her lap and was reading along with me. Word for word. Her eyes moving down the page at the same pace my voice was moving. July 9th, August 4th, September 1st. 3 more that summer, all dismissed. October, November, December of that year, 4 more complaints. Hanging planters, a bird feeder, mulch in the flower bed, a decorative rock filed as a code complaint. I looked up. A decorative rock. Someone filed an official code enforcement complaint about a rock in my yard. Alt 2022? 10 complaints. Garden edging? More driveway work? Paint colour that had been approved by the Architectural Review Board, but filed as an unapproved exterior modification anyway. Gutter cleaning? The steps on my front porch, which had been there 6 months before the complaint came in. I flipped through pages, my own handwriting, page after page, The same blue ballpoint pen I use for grocery lists and timesheets and notes from board meetings at work. The same pen I've had in my purse for 6 years because I like the way it writes, and I'm not going to throw out a good pen for no reason. Every complaint, every case number, every dismissal recorded in the same steady hand that had written it all down in the first place. 2023, 6 complaints. 2024, through September 9th, 6 more. Every single one dismissed. Not one violation, not one thing the county found wrong, but every single complaint was filed by the same person, the same neighbour, Douglas Haft, 6 Birchwood Court. The room changed. Not dramatically, but I felt it. The name, actually saying the name out loud in front of 83 people instead of just thinking it or writing it in the notebook, it shifted something. This wasn't abstract anymore. This wasn't a process. This was a neighbourhood resident accusing another neighbourhood resident of something in front of all their neighbours. And everyone in that room understood that once you said it that way, you couldn't unsay it. I closed the notebook. I held it in both hands. Not like a weapon, but not like an apology either. Like exactly what it was. A record. 3 years of precision. 3 years of paying attention. I kept this notebook because something told me to. Not rage. Not a plan. Just someone should be writing this down. And now that I've written it down, I think the question is, what does it mean that I had to? What does it mean for our neighbourhood that one person filed 22 complaints in 3 years and not a single one of them held up? What does it mean that the board president didn't call to ask if I was okay? Didn't meet with my neighbour to understand what was driving this? Didn't take any action other than processing the paperwork and filing it away? Gerald was looking at his clipboard again, but his eyes weren't tracking anything on the page. His hands were very still. The president of this board controls $142,000 in annual operating budget. Landscaping contracts, reserve fund allocation, code enforcement referral authority. That's the power. That's what we're voting for tonight. I'm running for that position because I think the power needs to be used differently. I'm running because someone has to be willing to look at what's actually happening in this neighbourhood instead of just processing it and pretending it's normal. I'm running because my neighbour decided 6 years ago that my presence here was a problem, and I decided 3 years ago to prove the record instead of just feeling the pressure. I set the notebook on the lectern. You've got the copies. You've seen them. Look them over. Read the dates. Read the dismissals. And then ask yourselves, do you want to vote for the status quo, or do you want something different? The room was entirely still now. Not tense, not theatrical. Just still in the way a room gets when people have just understood something that changes the question they thought they were voting on. I stepped back from the lectern and walked to my chair. My legs were steady as my hands weren't shaking. 3 years of bringing every complaint to the county. Calling the inspector to ask what I needed to fix. Doing the work and waiting for the next letter to arrive. 3 years of discipline. Of refusing to react. Of keeping the notebook in the same tote bag with my grocery list. Like it was just another piece of my life. All of that work was now sitting on a lectern in front of 83 people. And none of them could unsee it. Gerald called for a 5-minute recess. I watched him put his clipboard down and stand up, the movements careful and displaced, like a man who had just lost control of a meeting he thought was routine. The board members looked at each other. There was no conversation yet. They'd need those 5 minutes to talk, to figure out what was supposed to happen next, to decide if they were going to try to block the vote or just let it happen. I stayed in my seat. Priscilla Gaines sat 2 chairs over, and she didn't say anything, but she reached over and squeezed my hand. Quick, efficient, no drama. Ray Kowalski, who lived at 2 Birchwood and who I'd barely spoken to in 6 years, because he maintained this careful distance from everything that looked like neighborhood conflict, stood up and walked over to me and said, "You did good." And then he walked away before I could respond, which told me everything I needed to know about whether he'd been keeping score. When Gerald called the meeting back to order, the nomination came from the floor almost immediately. Someone seconded it before I could breathe. The board made a procedural argument that lasted 4 minutes and got nowhere. Gerald was trying to maintain the appearance that this was routine, but everyone could feel that he'd already lost the room. The vote happened at 7:34 p.m. 41 to 30. 11 votes. But that wasn't the end. That was the turning point. That was the moment everything I'd been patient about, everything I'd documented and kept quiet about and simply endured, turned into something else entirely. The election wasn't the payoff. It was the tool. The real thing I'd been keeping track of all along was something far more specific. And I didn't know how to explain that yet to anyone in that room. The president of the Pebblebrook Estates, HOA, controlled that $142,000. But what I was actually about to control was something much more useful. I had case numbers, I had inspector reports, I had 3 years of documentation in my own handwriting, and I had authority now. Let me back up and tell you how this started. Let me tell you about the woman I was before I understood that patience isn't weakness. That waiting longer than you should is not the same as being unable to move. I closed on 4 Birchwood Court on June 14th, 2018, at 10:37 a.m. in the office of a title company off Route 41 in Cobb County. And I remember the exact time because I had to be back at Piedmont Healthcare by 1 o'clock for a 3 to 6 p.m. shift in supply chain management. And I wasn't going to be late for it. I was 41 years old. I had been saving deliberately since I was 34, which meant 7 years of budgeting that looked like this. No vacations, no new car every 5 years like my friends were doing, no eating out more than twice a month, no premium cable channels, no new furniture, no designer handbags, no impulse purchases of anything. 7 years of knowing exactly what my direct deposit was on payday at 2:22 p. and knowing exactly where every dollar of it was going to land. When the title company handed me the keys, they felt heavy in my hand in a way I didn't expect. Not heavy from the metal, heavy from the 7 years it took to carry them to that moment. I had found this house 3 months earlier, a 2-story colonial on a corner lot in Pebblebrook Estates, and I'd put in an offer the same day my realtor showed it to me. The asking price was $340,000. That's exactly what the appraisal came back at when the bank did their inspection, which meant I wasn't overpaying. I'd saved $92,000 as a down payment, which gave me the math to be able to refinance in 10 years, and have the mortgage paid off before I turned 62. 10 years. I could see it. I could calculate it. I could hold it in my mind the way some people hold a prayer. The moving truck was scheduled for that Saturday. June 16th. I'd hired movers, which cost me $3,000 out of my first 6 months' budget for the house. But I couldn't take the time off work to move myself. And I wasn't going to spend a weekend asking friends to haul boxes while pretending it was fun. I had boxes packed since Tuesday. I had a spreadsheet on my phone that listed every room, every box number, and what went into it. I had taken photographs of the empty rooms so I could match them to the rooms in my new house and understand the dimensions before the moving truck pulled up. When the movers arrived at 6 a.m. on Saturday, on time, which was the only acceptable option, I was already there with coffee I'd brought from home in a thermos. And I walked through every room with them, pointing out the box numbers on my spreadsheet, making sure they understood the layout. By Saturday evening, the house was full of boxes. The furniture was there, not much furniture. Because I'd spent the last 7 years being intentional about what I brought in. A bed, a dresser, a leather sofa I'd found on a Facebook marketplace for $200, which the seller had barely used. A desk where I did my budgeting. The kitchen table was still in the moving truck because the movers had gotten it against the wall at the last second and then couldn't get it out without moving everything else. And I was too tired to deal with it, so I told them to leave it for Monday when I could arrange for someone to come back and extract it from the wreckage they'd created, trying to force it through the hallway. I drove back to my apartment, the one I'd been renting for 7 years, the one I'd chosen specifically because the rent was stable and the lease was month to month once the initial term was up, which meant I could leave the second my savings hit the number I needed. And I stayed the night there because my bed wasn't in my new house yet. And the idea of sleeping on the floor of a room full of boxes, even my own boxes, made me tired just thinking about it. Sunday morning, I packed a bag, changed my address on my autopay for the utilities, and texted my realtor a photo of the closing documents. Drove back to Pebblebrook Estates at 9 a.m. The neighborhood was quiet in the way that expensive suburban neighborhoods always are quiet. Not peaceful, but maintained. The houses were spaced apart, each one on a manicured lot, the kind of place where people who had saved their whole lives to own a specific image of success came to settle into it. I parked in my driveway and got out and stood there for a moment, just looking at the house. It was a nice house. Good bones, a wraparound porch, 3 bedrooms, 2.5 baths, the kind of house that said, "This person has her life together." A car pulled up across the street at one of the other properties, and a man got out, mid-50s, carrying a newspaper and a cup of coffee. He looked over at me, nodded, and waved. Not an enthusiastic wave, but a neighborly one, the kind of wave that said, "I see you. You're new here." "Welcome," I waved back. He went inside his house. That was Ray Kowalski from 2 Birchwood Court, though I didn't know his name yet. I would learn it later. I would learn that he waved every single weekday morning at the same time, from his driveway to the street where I occasionally stood checking the mail. I would learn that he'd lived in Pebblebrook Estates for 8 years and had never once signed one of the petitions that circulated through the neighborhood. I would learn that he attended exactly 0 HOA meetings I would learn that he maintained this careful, practiced distance from anything that looked like neighbourhood drama, and I would file all of that away without comment, because I had other things to think about. I opened the front door with my key. My key. Not a realtor's key. A key I now owned. And the house was completely empty, except for the boxes and the furniture and the knowledge that I'd spent 7 years building the right to be here. That afternoon, I started unpacking. I worked until 5 p.m. When I had to leave and drive back to my apartment to get the rest of my clothes and personal items, I still had a few weeks of my lease left to run, and I wasn't going to pay for an empty apartment. So I finished the move over several days, shuttling things back and forth. The sun was going down when I came back to Pebblebrook Estates around 7. I parked in my driveway, and as I was unlocking the front door, a man came out of the house at 6 Birchwood Court, directly across the street and one lot over. He was walking to his mailbox, and he looked at my house. Not at me, at the house, with the specific quality of attention that meant he was already taking inventory. He was older, maybe early 60s, with grey hair and the kind of posture that comes from having spent a lifetime building infrastructure that was supposed to last. He was wearing khakis and a pressed polo shirt. He looked at my corner lot, at the moving truck that was still parked out front, at the open door and the boxes visible through the windows. He got his mail. He turned and walked back to his house. He didn't wave. He didn't nod. He just looked and calculated and went inside. I didn't think about it much at the time. There are people in every neighbourhood who watch new people arrive and take a minute to understand whether they're going to be an asset or a problem. I figured he was just that type. I didn't know then that I would spend the next 3 years figuring out how to prove to a code enforcement officer that a decorative rock is not actually a violation of Cobb County ordinances. Monday evening, the movers came back and extracted the kitchen table from the hallway. By Tuesday morning, the house was starting to look like a place where someone actually lived. I made the bed. I organised the kitchen. I put groceries in the refrigerator. Coffee, milk, oat bread, chicken breast, broccoli, brown rice, the fundamentals of the diet I'd been on for 7 years, because it kept me at the weight I'd been at for 7 years, because I knew exactly what the maintenance costs were, and they fit in my budget. I was proud of that kitchen. I was proud of every single thing in that house, because I had chosen it and paid for it and carried it to this place with my own deliberate intention. By Sunday evening of that first full week, I had the house mostly unpacked. The furniture was arranged. The boxes were broken down and stacked in the garage. The living room looked like a living room, and I realised I hadn't eaten a real meal in the house yet. I'd been grabbing breakfast at work and eating lunch at my desk and stopping at drive-thrus on my way back to organise things. So I went to the gas station on the corner of Birchwood and Cobb Parkway and bought a sandwich, turkey and provolone on a roll, which cost $4.99. And I drove back to my house and sat down on the hardwood floor in the empty living room, right in front of the window that looked out onto the front porch, and I ate that sandwich. It was 8:43 p.m. The sun was going down. The light in the living room was getting softer, filtering through the windows in that particular way late spring light does. Golden, almost liquid. I sat there on the floor of my own house, eating a gas station sandwich. And I recited to myself the number that had carried me through 7 years of discipline. The payoff date. The moment when this house would be completely mine. When the last check would be mailed to the bank and the deed would be clear. June of 2028. That's what I whispered to myself, sitting on that empty floor with turkey and provolone. June of 2028. 7 more years. 184 more months of the mortgage payment at $1,278.43 on the first of every month. And then this house would be mine in a way that made the word mine mean something completely different from how it meant anything else in my life. This house was worth $340,000 on paper. But in that moment, with the sandwich still in my hand and the empty room around me, and the exact date of freedom hanging in front of me, like something I could reach out and touch, it was worth infinitely more than that. It was the proof that discipline works, that planning works, that if you refuse to be distracted, if you say no to every small comfort that costs money, if you show up to work and do your job and deposit your paycheck and move that money into savings, if you wait 7 years and follow the math, you get to be standing on the hardwood floor of a house that is actually, legally, mathematically yours. Not a place you're renting, not a place someone else owns and is letting you live in. A place you built by making 1,000 small decisions that all added up to the same thing. Get here. Stay here. Make it yours. I thought about all the women before me who had done this. My mother, who had saved and bought a townhouse in Atlanta when I was 8 years old, and had kept it for 32 years. My grandmother, who had owned her own home in Louisiana for more than 50 years, and had left it to my mother, who had left it to me in her will. Which is why I had part of the down payment for this house. Because there was that inheritance, small but solid. And I had invested it into the future, the way women in my family had always invested in the future. I was standing on the floor of my own house with a gas station sandwich in my hand because I had learned from them how to want something and wait for it and not settle for less than what I actually deserved. I didn't know then that the man in the khakis at 6 Birchwood Court had decided already, in that moment when he looked at my house, that my arrival was a problem that would require solving. I didn't know that in less than 3 years, the notebook I would keep on my kitchen counter to track my grocery expenses would become the most important document I'd ever own. I didn't know any of that. I just knew that I was home and I was going to stay here, and that June of 2028 was the specific moment when everything I'd worked for would finally, completely be mine. I installed the fence post the 3rd weekend in April, which sounds like, I did the actual work myself. And I want to be clear. I hired a licensed contractor to do it, the kind of person who shows up with a truck full of equipment and knows exactly what he's doing. I paid him to install them properly, and he took his time with it. He measured the property line using the survey I'd had done the year before. $2,300 for a licensed surveyor to come out and mark exactly where my land ended and the common area began. And he marked the spot with a chalk line. He dug the holes to the depth the county required. He set the posts in concrete and waited 48 hours for it to cure before declaring the job done. I wasn't cutting corners. I wasn't experimenting. I was making a capital improvement to a house I owned. the way homeowners do, the way I had the right to do. The fence itself was going to be attractive. It was going to be wooden, stained a natural colour. And it was going to mark the boundary between my property and the rest of the development. That was the point. That's what property lines are for. They mark where one person's responsibility begins and ends. Mine began at my house and extended to those posts. What was beyond the posts belonged to the development. What was on my side of the posts was mine. The setback, the distance from the house to the posts, was exactly as much as it needed to be. The contractor had measured it. The original survey confirmed it. The county ordinances allowed it. Everything was in compliance. I knew this because I'd spent 3 years learning the code and the ordinances. I'd learned them the way I learn everything. Thoroughly. With attention to detail. Making sure I understand the rules before I follow them. On April 14th, a Wednesday, I got home from work at 6:30 p.m. and there was a notice stuck to my front door. Not a letter in the mailbox. Not something I could ignore. A notice taped to my front door, visible to anyone who happened to walk past. A notice from Cobb County Code Enforcement. A complaint had been filed against my property. Case number CE 2021 0047. The complaint was about the fence posts. I stood on my porch, holding the paper. The complaint had been filed on April 12th, the day after the contractor finished the installation. I hadn't even taken a photograph of the finished product yet. I hadn't shown it to any of the neighbours, or mentioned it to anyone. I just had the work completed. And someone had already called code enforcement to report me. The notice said an inspector would visit to measure the setback and verify that the installation was in compliance with local ordinances. The inspection was scheduled for April 19th. That was 6 days away. 6 days of knowing that someone had reported me and waiting to be inspected. The way you'd wait for a diagnosis. I went inside and sat down at the kitchen table with the notice in front of me. It was a standard form. Complaint type, property address, case number, alleged violation. The alleged violation was listed as improper fence post placement, possible setback violation. That was the allegation. That was what someone, and I already knew who, though I wasn't ready to fully admit it to myself yet, had reported to the county. I called the contractor. I read him the notice over the phone. His response was immediate and calm. The posts were fine. The setback was correct. The inspection would confirm it, and I shouldn't worry. But something in his voice had changed. He wasn't reassuring me. He was managing a situation he'd seen before. He knew the game. He knew that sometimes you do everything right, and people call the authorities anyway. And then you have to wait for the authorities to come and confirm that you did everything right. The 6 days between the complaint and the inspection felt longer than they were. Every time someone drove past the house slowly, I wondered if it was him, Douglas Haft, at 6 Birchwood, checking to see if the posts were still there. Every time I looked at the fence, I found myself measuring it again in my mind, checking the angles, confirming the compliance, as if my worrying might change whether it was in setback. It wouldn't. But I worried anyway. April 19th came. I asked for the afternoon off work and stayed home. The inspector's name was Terrell Bird, He pulled up in a marked county truck at 2:05 p.m, carrying a clipboard and a metal measuring tape, and I could see from the moment he stepped out of the truck that he knew what this was. He knew this wasn't about fence posts. He knew this was about a neighborhood disagreement that had climbed into the official system. He had to measure the post anyway, because that was his job. But he knew. He introduced himself and explained what he was there to do. His tone professional, but not unkind. He asked to see the property survey. I handed him the document the surveyor had prepared. The 47-page report that had cost me $2,300 and mapped every inch of my property line. He looked at it, reading carefully, and nodded. He understood what I was showing him. I had done my homework. I had paid for professional documentation. He pulled out his tape measure. He held one end at the back corner of my house, the point from which the setback was measured, and extended the tape to the fence posts. He recorded the number on his clipboard. He measured again, from a different angle, to confirm. He walked the entire line of posts, measuring, writing, nodding to himself. I stood on my back porch and watched him work. He was thorough. He was careful. He was doing exactly what he should be doing. When he finished, he looked up at me and said, "Ma'am, your posts are within setback. This is in compliance with the county ordinance." I didn't respond immediately. I was waiting for what was coming next. "The installation meets the requirements," he continued. "There's no violation here." And then he looked at me, really looked at me, and in his eyes, I saw something that wasn't spoken. An apology. Not a verbal apology, because he was a county employee and couldn't go around apologizing for the work he was assigned to do. But a look that said, "I understand what this is. I'm sorry you're in this situation. I see you did everything right, and someone called me anyway, and I had to come out and measure something that was never wrong." I would remember that look for 3 years. I would describe it to Marlene Vargas, my lawyer, and to Priscilla Gaines, my friend. That look from Terrell Bird, the apologetic look that was the only honest thing in the entire process. He finished his paperwork and told me the case would be marked as dismissed. No violation found. He got back in his truck at 2:42 p.m. I noticed the time and drove away. I stood in my yard for a moment. The fence posts hadn't moved. They were still exactly where they'd been before the inspection. They were in compliance. They had been in compliance before the complaint. They were in compliance after the measurement. And someone in this neighborhood had still decided to call code enforcement. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table and didn't eat dinner. I didn't call anyone. I just sat there thinking about what had happened. But someone had reported me. Someone had filed a formal complaint with a county agency. Someone had decided that my fence posts were a problem that required official intervention. At 7:30 p.m., I got up and drove to Dollar General. I don't remember making a conscious decision to go. I found myself in the car, driving to the store, walking to the school supply aisle. I picked up a green composition notebook, the kind you could buy in a pack of 3 for $6.99. I also bought a pack of blue ballpoint pens, the same kind I used for grocery lists and work memos and notes during supply chain meetings. I paid $7.43 and drove back home. I sat down at the kitchen table. I opened the notebook to the first page. I uncapped the blue pen. At the very top, I wrote CE 2021 0047. Date April 14th, 2021. Inspector Terrell Bird. Outcome dismissed. No violation found. Then I held the pen and sat there for what felt like a very long time. And I wrote a second line. Just one word. Why? With a question mark after it. I sat there looking at that word. Why? On the second line of a notebook. I didn't know yet that I was going to fill with 22 more entries. A notebook that would eventually become a campaign document. And I crossed it out. I drew one long line through the word, making it illegible but not erased. You could still see it was there. You could still know I'd written it, but it was crossed out. Because asking why wouldn't change anything. Asking why was indulgent. The answer was already clear. Someone didn't want me here. And he was going to use whatever tools he could find to remind me of that. Writing down why wouldn't help. It wouldn't answer the question. It would just take up space in the notebook where facts belonged. So I wrote a new second line. Fence posts inspect. Apologised with his eyes. That was the observation. That was what mattered. Not the complaint, not the violation that didn't exist, but the look on Terrell Bird's face, the humanity of it, the fact that he saw me, and he saw what was happening, and he was sorry. I set the notebook on the counter. I didn't think, in that moment, that I was starting something that would eventually change everything. I thought that someone should be writing this down. Someone should have a record of what happened. Not because it would matter to anyone else, just because it had happened, and I needed to know that I had documented it accurately. The next time a complaint came, and I already understood, with a clarity that was almost physical, that there would be a next time, I would record it the same way. Case number, date, inspector name, outcome, observation. The format would never change. The blue pen would never change. The notebook would keep filling, one entry after another, each one a piece of a pattern I was documenting without yet understanding that patterns, when you record them long enough, become evidence. That evidence, when you show it to enough people, becomes something else entirely. It becomes a reason to believe you. But that night, I just sat there with the notebook open, the blue pen still in my hand, and I thought about what I had learned. Someone could do everything right and be reported anyway. Someone could comply with the rules and still be investigated. Someone could pass inspection and still be suspected. Someone could own a house and still be made to feel like she didn't belong. So I would document. That's all. I would write down what happened, who came, what they found, what they said. Someone should know. Someone should have the record. And if that someone was just me, just a woman sitting at her kitchen table at night after work, keeping a notebook in a green composition book purchased at Dollar General for $7.43, and then that would be enough. That notebook would become the most important document I'd ever own, not because I knew it at the time, but because I understood, sitting there with that blue pen in my hand, that precision was a form of power, that paying attention was a form of resistance, that the only defense against someone else's story about you is your own documented truth. The discipline started that night. Precision, not anger. Facts, not feelings. A record that could not be disputed because every page would be in my own handwriting, in blue ballpoint pen, on the pages of a notebook that proved I was paying attention to everything he did, and I was keeping score. The second complaint came in May. The third came in June. By July, I understood that Douglas Haft wasn't filing complaints about violations. He was filing complaints about visibility. Complaint number 3 was about the mailbox post. I'd replaced it in early June. The old one had rotted at the base, which happens to wood in the ground after long enough. And a new post is a normal maintenance item, the kind of thing homeowners do without thinking twice. But Douglas had noticed the replacement the day after I had the contractor install it. He'd filed the complaint within 48 hours. The case number was CE 20-21-0058. The inspector's name was Marcus Chen. He measured the post. He found it was properly installed. He dismissed the complaint. Complaint number 4 was about the driveway. I'd hired someone to power wash it in mid-June, and you could see the difference immediately. The concrete went from grey-brown to bright grey, which made the whole front of the house look newer, more cared for, more like the property of someone who had time and money to maintain things. Douglas filed that complaint on the 3rd day after the work was finished. The inspector measured the setback, found nothing wrong, dismissed it. Complaint number 5 was about hanging planters. I'd bought 4 terracotta planters with trailing petunias. Real petunias, the kind you have to deadhead and water regularly, not plastic flowers, and hung them from the beam above my front porch. They were decorative. They weren't modifying the structure. They were literally just plants in pots, living things that I was choosing to care for in a visible way. But they changed the way the house looked from the street. They made it clear that someone was living there. Someone was tending it. Someone was making it prettier. Douglas filed that complaint 4 days after I hung them. The pattern was simple once I saw it. Douglas Haft filed a complaint within 2 weeks of every visible improvement I made. Not every violation. There were no violations. But every time I did something that made my house look different, better, more cared for. Douglas responded by calling code enforcement. It was as methodical as a clock. Improvement on a Saturday. Complaint filed by Thursday. I kept the notebook updated. Every complaint got the same treatment. Case number, date, inspector name, outcome, all dismissed. None of them held. By August of 2021, I had 8 dismissed complaints recorded in blue ballpoint pen. By December, I had 12 separate investigations, 12 separate visits from county inspectors. 12 times code enforcement had found nothing wrong. 12 times I had done something normal, painted, landscaped, repaired, improved, and 12 times Douglas had reported me. 12 times someone had to come out and measure my property line or my driveway or inspect my porch posts. And 12 times the county had wasted resources on complaints that were never violations in the first place. 12 times someone had to confirm, officially, that I had done nothing wrong. I started mapping what he could see from his property. His house at 6 Birchwood had a direct line of sight to my front yard and porch. He could see everything. Every new plant I put in, every mulch refresh, every time I swept the concrete, every improvement, every effort I made to maintain the place I owned. He was watching, and the moment something changed, he reported it. I didn't talk about this to Priscilla yet. I didn't tell Marlene Vargas, my lawyer, because I didn't think I needed a lawyer over landscaping complaints. I just logged each one and kept living my life, kept maintaining my house, kept doing the things you do when you own property and want it to be nice. I was still operating on the assumption that eventually someone in authority would see the pattern and say, enough. Eventually, this would stop. Then came the 2022 board meeting in February. I went because I thought I should be heard. I thought the board needed to understand what was happening. And maybe they would intervene. Maybe they would tell Douglas to stop filing frivolous complaints. Maybe someone would acknowledge that 12 dismissed complaints in 8 months was not normal, was not acceptable, was excessive. I dressed carefully. I brought my notebook, though I didn't think I'd need it. I brought copies of the dismissal letters. I drove to the community centre where the meetings were held and sat down in the 3rd row of folding chairs. My notebook in my lap, ready to speak during the comment period. Gerald Breckett ran the meeting. He was a retired banker in his late 60s, the kind of man who wore golf shirts to neighbourhood meetings and took his role very seriously as someone responsible for maintaining order, for keeping things running smoothly, for avoiding conflict. He moved through the agenda quickly. Landscaping contracts, reserve fund updates, a discussion about new mailbox standards for the development. Everything was proceeding normally. I was waiting for my moment. Then Douglas asked to address the board. He didn't request permission. He just stood up from his seat in the front row and turned to face the room. And Gerald nodded like he'd been expecting this. Like Douglas had called ahead to tell him he wanted to speak. And Douglas delivered without being asked, without anyone requesting a speech, a 5-minute address about neighbourhood standards that changed everything. I want to talk about something that's been on my mind, Douglas said. His voice was calm, reasonable. He wasn't angry. He didn't sound vindictive. He sounded like someone who had been thinking carefully about an important topic and wanted to share his insights with the community. Consistent, visible standards protect every owner's investment. When homes in a neighbourhood are maintained to a consistent level. When people take care of their properties in a way that's visible and intentional. That protects the value for everyone. It's not about aesthetics alone. It's about demonstrating a commitment to the community. It's about sending a message that this is a neighbourhood where standards matter. He gestured toward his own house, which everyone in that room knew about. 6 Birchwood Court, his immaculate yard, his landscaping maintained to perfection, his driveway spotless, his mailbox exactly right, his house as the model, his standards as the standard. When one property owner takes it upon themselves to make changes without understanding how those changes affect the broader visual character of the neighbourhood, I think the board has an obligation to step in. Douglas continued. He wasn't looking at me. He was being careful. I'm not talking about anyone specific. I'm just saying that consistency is important. And I think our code enforcement processes should reflect that. When complaints are filed, they should be taken seriously, not dismissed automatically. Because the people filing those complaints are trying to protect the neighbourhood's identity. They're trying to maintain standards. And that's something the board should respect. He sat down. I was sitting in the third row with my notebook in my lap, and something shifted in me. It landed like ice in my chest. I realized something with absolute clarity. Douglas wasn't going to stop. Because he wasn't being driven by violations. He was being driven by something else, entirely. By the fact of my presence, by my ownership, by my refusal to be invisible. And he had just spent 5 minutes entirely. By the fact of my presence, by my ownership, by my refusal to be invisible. And he had just spent 5 minutes in front of the entire HOA explaining why my refusal to be invisible was a problem. More than that, he had framed it as concern. Concern for standards, concern for the neighborhood, concern for property values, concern for consistency. He had made it sound reasonable. He had made it sound like he was trying to protect something valuable. When what he was actually trying to protect was the neighborhood as he had always imagined it, which was a neighborhood where people like him set the standards, and where people like me either complied or left. I looked at Gerald. He was nodding slightly, not enthusiastically, but definitely nodding, not contradicting, not questioning, not saying, well, actually, we've had 12 code enforcement inspections in 8 months, and the inspector found 0 violations. Just nodding, accepting Douglas's framing, making it clear that the board president thought Douglas's concerns were legitimate. I looked around the room. There were maybe 30 people there. Some of them had signed neighborhood petitions in the past. Some of them were people I'd waved to when I was checking my mail. Some of them I'd never seen before. None of them raised their hand. None of them said, I think people should be able to paint their driveways without being reported. None of them said, hanging planters aren't a violation. None of them defended me. The board moved on to the next agenda item. Someone raised a question about landscaping maintenance standards. Gerald answered. The room settled back into routine. I sat there with my notebook in my lap. And I understood something that I had been trying not to understand for 8 months. Compliance wasn't going to save me. Following the rules wasn't going to make this stop. Code enforcement had already confirmed 12 times that I was doing nothing wrong. And Douglas was still going to file complaints. And Gerald was still going to nod along. Because the point wasn't compliance. The point was control. The point was making sure I understood that I was living in a neighborhood where one man's definition of standards mattered more than my right to own my property the way I wanted to own it. That was the moment. That was when I stopped thinking about defending myself and started thinking about changing the board. That was when I understood that the only way to stop Douglas was to take the power away from the person who wasn't stopping him. And the only way to do that was to become the person making the decisions. I closed my notebook. I didn't speak during the comment period. I didn't try to explain. I didn't defend myself. I just listened. I watched Gerald nod. I watched Douglas sit there satisfied that he'd made his point. And I thought about elections. I thought about board positions. I thought about what happens when you have a record of everything someone has done to you, documented in your own handwriting, in chronological order, with case numbers and dates and inspector names. I thought about running for president. Complaint number 13 came on January 12th. 2022. It was about the garden edging I'd installed in November. Metal border around a flower bed. held in the ground with landscape stakes. A clean line between the planted area and the mulch. Complaint 14 was filed 4 days later, on January 16th, about paint colour. The colour had been approved by the Architectural Review Board. I had the approval letter on file, dated August 21st, 2021, but Douglas reported it as unapproved exterior modification. Complaint 15, January 23rd, was about gutter cleaning. I'd hired someone to clean out the gutters, get the leaves and debris out. The inspector came out and looked at them and said they were fine. Dismissed. Complaint 16 was filed in March about the steps on my front porch. 6 months. I'd installed those steps in July of 2021. 6 months before Douglas reported them. 6 months of seeing them every day before he decided they were a problem. Complaint 17 was about a bird feeder. A simple wooden bird feeder that I'd hung on the fence. The inspector found nothing wrong. Complaint 18 was filed in May about mulch. I'd refreshed the mulch in one of my flower beds, made it look neater and darker, and Douglas filed a complaint 3 days after I had it done. Complaint 19 was about more driveway work. I'd had the driveway sealed and restriped. Complaint 20 was about a decorative rock, the kind of thing people put in yards as a focal point or accent. $18. Meant to look nice. The inspector came out and found nothing wrong. Complaint 21 came in August and was about landscaping overhaul. He didn't specify what landscaping. He just filed a general complaint that my landscaping violated some unspecified provision. This is what I want you to understand about accumulation. By the end of 2022, I had 21 dismissed complaints. Not 5, not 10. 21 times someone had come to my property in an official capacity and found nothing wrong. 21 times Douglas had called code enforcement. 21 times the process had confirmed that I had done nothing illegal. Nothing against ordinance. Nothing that violated any rule. The specificity matters. The dates matter. The case numbers matter. CE 2022. 0067 on January 12th. CE 2022. 0094 on January 16th. CE 2022. 0118 on January 23rd. I have them all written down in blue ballpoint pen, in the same green notebook, with the same format that I'd established the first night I bought it at Dollar General. Case number, date. Inspector name, outcome, 1-line observation. I was approaching 20. I was past 20. Each complaint was its own entry. Each one was documented. Each one was dismissed. I watched the pattern solidify on the pages of that notebook. Improvement, then report. Work done on my house, then a complaint filed. Visible change, then official notice. The spacing was consistent. Douglas wasn't random. He was responsive. Every time I did something to make my house look different, better, more cared for, he reacted. Within 2 weeks. Sometimes within days. He reported it. I decided to show Priscilla. She had been my friend since we met at an HOA meeting 3 years earlier. She was a retired middle school teacher, 52 years old, and she had that particular quality of someone who had spent decades managing difficult situations and difficult people. She'd organized things, confronted things, built communities. She understood power and how it moved through institutions. I drove to her house on a Saturday morning in early 2023 with all 21 dismissal letters printed out and organized by date in a manila folder. I walked into her dining room and spread them across the table like evidence. Like a record. Like a pattern that was impossible to deny if someone looked closely enough. Priscilla looked at them. She read the first one. Then the second. Then the third. Then she went through them chronologically. And I watched her face change in real time, like I was watching someone live through a controlled collapse of their composure. First came denial. There's no way. 21? That can't be right. Are you counting these right? She was counting the pages herself, making sure I wasn't exaggerating, wasn't inflating the numbers out of frustration or hurt. Then came anger. Real anger. The kind of anger that comes from understanding that someone has been methodically harassing a person you care about while the institutional system has done nothing to stop it. This is insane. This is actual harassment. He's literally harassing you with the code enforcement system. Why isn't anyone stopping this? Why is Gerald allowing this? Why isn't the board doing anything? She was standing up, pacing around her dining room, her hands opening and closing at her sides. Then came bargaining. There has to be something we can do. We can contact the county commissioner. We can request a formal meeting with the board. We can file a complaint about Douglas. We can report him to the state bar, or there has to be something someone can do about this. She was looking for a solution, a way to fix the broken system, a way to make someone in authority care enough to intervene. Then came depression, or what looked like it, a kind of deflation. She sat back down at the table and just looked at the letters, fanned out across the surface. I can't believe this has been happening for over a year, and nobody knows. You've been dealing with this completely alone. You've just been documenting it and living with it and not telling anybody. She was quieter now, thinking about what it meant that I'd been absorbing this by myself. Then came acceptance. But it wasn't the kind of acceptance that meant resignation or surrender. It was the kind of acceptance that came with a decision, a shift in thinking. She looked up at me and said, very quietly, "You're not going to be able to outgood him, no. You're not going to make this stop by being better, by complying more, by following every rule perfectly. You understand that, right? You could paint your house beige, remove every flower, tear out every plant, and he would still find something. The point isn't compliance. The point is that you're there." I nodded. "So what are we going to do about it?" she asked. That was the question that led me to Marlene Vargas. Marlene's office was in Marietta, a suite of rooms that looked like a successful law practice. Real wood furniture, shelves of legal books, organized by subject. The kind of space that told you this attorney had built something substantial. Marlene herself was in her mid-40s, sharp in the way that came from reading people and institutions for patterns the way I read supply chains. She was an HOA and real estate attorney, which meant she understood the specific way that community rules could be weaponized and the specific way that patterns of behavior could be documented and presented as evidence. I brought the notebook. I brought all 21 dismissal letters. I brought the case numbers and dates, organized chronologically. I brought the documentation of my improvements, the dates I'd had work done, the correlation between work and complaints. I laid everything out for her on her desk. Marlene read through the documentation with the precision of someone checking a contract line by line. She made notes on a legal pad. She asked questions about specific complaints, about dates, about what triggered each one. She cross-referenced the dismissal letters with the notebook entries. She pulled out a calendar and started marking dates, creating a visual timeline. And when she finished, she set everything down and looked at me. "Okay," she said. "Here's what I'm seeing. Technically, each individual complaint is lawful. Douglas can file complaints with code enforcement. That's his right as a resident. Technically, each one is defensible. He's not filing false information. He's reporting what he thinks is a problem. The inspector comes out, measures, finds nothing wrong, dismisses the case. From a strictly legal standpoint, that process is working exactly as designed." I waited. I could tell there was more. But, she continued, and this was the word that changed everything. The pattern is something else entirely. The pattern documented the way you've documented it, with dates, case numbers, specific details about what triggered each complaint, a clear correlation between your improvements and his complaints. That pattern constitutes evidence of targeted harassment. That's actionable. That's actually legally significant. She leaned forward slightly, her hands folded on the desk. What you have here is not just a collection of complaints. What you have is a documented campaign of harassment using the code enforcement system as a tool. That's not legal. That's an abuse of process. That's a civil violation. And because you've been methodical about recording it, because you have dates and specificity, because every single one was dismissed, because the pattern is clear and undeniable, you can make an argument that this person is using an official system to harass you. That's actionable. I felt something shift in my chest. For months, maybe longer, I'd been treating each complaint as an isolated incident. Complaint 3, complaint 4, complaint 5, each one separate, each one to be processed individually, each one something I just had to endure. But Marlene was right. The pattern was the thing. The accumulation was the evidence. The documentation was power. "There are things we can do with this," Marlene said. "We can send a cease and desist letter, formally documenting that you're aware of the pattern and that you've consulted with an attorney about it. We can formally document the harassment. We can make it clear that you know what's happening and that continuing this pattern has legal consequences. Some people stop when they realize they might face actual liability." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Some don't. Some people double down. But at minimum, we'd be putting him on notice that you're not just enduring this anymore. You're documenting it. You're building a case. You're aware of what's happening, and you're taking action." "What kind of case?" I asked. "Harassment, potentially, abuse of process, tortious interference with your quiet enjoyment of your property. These are civil matters, but they have real teeth. And if he continues, if he files more complaints after being notified that you've documented the pattern and that you're aware it's harassment, that strengthens the case significantly. It shows intent. It shows that he knew what he was doing and did it anyway." She set the notebook down on the desk between us, exactly where I'd placed it. "The thing about patterns," Marlene said, "is that once you see them, once you document them, once you can show them to someone who understands their significance, They become evidence. Right now, what you have is a record that proves you've been targeted. Not once, not twice, 21 times. That's not a series of coincidences. That's a pattern. And a pattern is proof. I looked at the notebook sitting there on her desk. All those case numbers, all those dates, all that blue ballpoint pen, all that precision, all that discipline I'd maintained through every complaint and dismissal. What do I need to do? I asked. Keep doing what you're doing. Marlene said, document everything. Keep the notebook. Record every complaint, every date, every outcome. If he files more complaints, which he probably will because people like him don't stop just because someone is paying attention, add them to the record. Build the case. And when the time is right, when you're ready, we'll use it. I drove home from Marlene's office with the notebook on the passenger seat. And for the first time in nearly 2 years, I wasn't thinking about how to avoid triggering the next complaint. I wasn't thinking about what home improvement I should skip, what landscaping I should leave undone, what visible care for my property I should suppress. I was thinking about the fact that every complaint, every dismissal, every single piece of documentation I had meticulously recorded was now evidence. Not evidence that I'd done something wrong, evidence that someone else had. The 22 dismissals weren't a burden anymore. They were ammunition. The 22nd complaint arrived on September 9th, 2024. Case CE 2024. 0189. It was about the raised garden bed I'd built over Labor Day weekend. September 1st and 2nd, a Saturday and Sunday. I'd wanted a dedicated space to grow herbs and vegetables. I'd planned it carefully, sketched it out, bought untreated cedar wood that wouldn't leach chemicals into the soil. I'd measured the setback 3 times, consulted the county ordinances online, made sure everything was exactly right. The bed was 3 feet from my property line. It was well within my rights. It was, by every measure, correct. The complaint came in on Monday, September 9th. I called Cobb County Code Enforcement to check on it before I heard anything official. The case had already been logged. Someone, and I knew exactly who, had filed it on September 3rd, the day after I finished the bed. Not even 24 hours after I'd set the last piece of wood in place. I didn't panic. By then, panic wasn't an option. I'd been through this 21 times. I knew the rhythm. The complaint arrives. The notice gets taped to my door. I'll wait for the inspection. The inspector comes out. The inspector measures. The inspector finds that whatever I did is exactly where it's supposed to be. The case gets dismissed. I write it down in the notebook. I move on. The cycle repeats itself. But I also knew something else by September of 2024. I was tired. Not tired the way you get tired from a long day at work. Tired the way you get tired when you've been fighting the same battle for 3.5 years and there's no end in sight. Tired in a way that settled into my bones. I called Gerald Breckett. He was still the HOA president, still maintaining his position, still choosing his battles, which meant choosing not to engage in this one. Gerald, this is Renata Moss from 4 Birchwood. I said, I'm calling about the code enforcement complaint that was filed today. I heard about it, he said. He sounded tired too, in his own way. The tiredness of someone who had chosen a comfortable path and was going to keep walking it. This is the 22nd complaint at 22 over 3.5 years, and every single one has been dismissed. There's no violation. There's never been a violation. This person is using the code enforcement system as a tool against me, and I'm wondering if the board can do anything about it. There was a pause. In that pause, I heard everything I needed to hear. I heard his comfort with the situation as it currently stood. I heard his decision not to get involved, not to take sides, not to acknowledge that anything unusual was happening. I heard him choosing what he thought was neutrality, not understanding that neutrality is a choice, and that choice has consequences. I don't feel like it would be appropriate for the board to intervene in what's essentially a neighbor dispute, Gerald said. His voice was steady. He believed this. That's between you and the county to sort out. I think the board should stay out of it. It's not a neighbor dispute, Gerald. It's harassment. It's targeted harassment. That's different. I understand your frustration, he said, which meant he didn't understand and had no interest in understanding. But I think this is the kind of thing where you and your neighbor need to find a way to work this out, or you need to pursue it through legal channels. The board needs to stay neutral in these kinds of situations. I didn't respond immediately. I was understanding something with sudden clarity. Gerald wasn't going to help me. Gerald wasn't even going to acknowledge that this was a problem. Gerald was going to maintain what he thought of as his comfortable neutrality and let this continue indefinitely. Because his comfort mattered more than my peace. And he was content with that arrangement. Okay, I said. Thank you for your time. I hung up and sat there holding the phone in my hand. That evening, I was sitting at my kitchen table with the notebook open in front of me. All 21 entries from the past 3.5 years were visible. The pages were filled with my handwriting, case numbers, dates, inspector names, outcomes, one-line observations. Every single entry documented a complaint that had no basis in reality. Every single page proved that I had done nothing wrong. Every single case number represented a day when the system had been used against me and had then dismissed its own use of itself. The kitchen table was where I paid my bills every month. It was where I sat with my morning coffee and my wall calendar, planning my week and my month. It was where I kept my household files and my work correspondence. It was where I made my decisions. It was where I understood the things that mattered. I was still sitting there when Destiny came home from Spelman that weekend. She was 19 years old, a sophomore, home for a long weekend. She walked into the kitchen and found me sitting in the light from the lamp above the table. The notebook open, all those pages visible, all those case numbers and dates and outcomes spread before me like evidence, like a map. She stood there for a moment, looking at me, and then at the notebook. I could see her trying to understand what she was looking at. She recognized the notebook. I'd mentioned it, shown her pages, explained the documentation, but this was different. This was me sitting alone at the kitchen table with it open, not working, not reading, just sitting there with it. She asked the question that broke something open. Mama, when does it stop? I didn't answer. I couldn't. I didn't have an answer. I didn't know when it would stop. I didn't know if it would ever stop. I didn't know what the end point was supposed to be. Compliance so complete that I became invisible. Enough dismissals that Douglas finally gave up. A legal victory that cost more money and time than I could spare. What was the finish line? For 11 seconds. And I remember this time span with absolute precision, as if those seconds were each marked and numbered like case numbers on a complaint form. Neither of us spoke. Old Destiny standing in the kitchen doorway. Me sitting at the kitchen table with the notebook open in front of me. The silence between us was heavy with everything I hadn't articulated to her. It was full of the weight of 3.5 years of documentation. It was full of the understanding that no amount of endurance, no amount of compliance, no amount of perfect behavior was going to change this situation as long as I was waiting for someone else to change it. Then I turned to the first page of the notebook. April 14th, 2021, Case CE 2021, 0047. The fence posts. The beginning. The page that started everything. I traced the case number with one finger, moving slowly across the numbers and letters that I'd written that first evening, when I didn't even know why I was keeping the notebook. Just that someone should be writing this down. And something shifted in me. I felt it the way you feel a door closing in a room you thought was open, or a door opening in a wall you thought was solid. I couldn't quite tell which direction the shift was going, but there was a moment where something inside me changed trajectory entirely. I wasn't looking at the notebook the same way anymore. I wasn't thinking about it as a chronicle of what had been done to me, a record of someone else's behavior. I was thinking about it as something else, something with intention, something with purpose. I didn't say anything. I just sat there with my finger on that first case number, and Destiny watched my face change. She saw the moment when I stopped being someone who was being done to and started being someone who was about to do something. Later, the next morning, she called Priscilla Gaines and described what she'd witnessed the way only someone who knew me deeply could describe it. She was sitting at the kitchen table, Destiny said, and something just shifted. She stopped looking at it like a record of what happened to her. She stopped looking at it like something that was being done to her. She started looking at it like a weapon. That word, weapon. It wasn't angry. It was just clear. It was the clarity of someone who had finally understood that the tool could be turned around, that the notebook wasn't just a record anymore. It was evidence. It was ammunition. It was a way forward. I didn't sleep much that night. I just sat there with the notebook, waiting for the 20-second complaint to be officially logged so I could add it to the pages. Waiting for the inspection, waiting for the dismissal, waiting for the moment when I would stop waiting and start acting. Priscilla called at 7:14 the morning after Destiny called her. I was getting ready for work, standing in my bathroom with the mirror fogged from the shower, and I didn't recognize the number at first. But when I answered, it was her, and she didn't bother with hello. You have 22 dismissed complaints, a lawyer, and 8 weeks before the nomination deadline, Priscilla said. She was a retired middle school teacher, 52 years old, and she had that voice that came from spending decades telling people what they needed to understand, and then waiting with complete calm for them to catch up. run for president of that HOA. I was holding my coffee in one hand and my phone in the other, and I was still wearing my bathrobe. I didn't say anything. "Did you hear me?" she asked. "I heard you." And what? "And are you going to do it?" I set the coffee down on the bathroom sink, next to my hairbrush and my deodorant. "Prissy, I don't know anything about running for HOA president. I don't know if there are requirements or procedures, or I don't even know if they'll let me run." "They will," she said. "I already looked it up. You file nomination paperwork with the Cobb County HOA registry by October 4th. You need one board member to second your nomination, or you can collect signatures from residents. The annual meeting is October 16th. You have 2 weeks from the deadline to campaign. That's enough time if you're smart about it, and you're smart." Priscilla had organized school board petitions. She had organized neighborhood watch rosters. She had organized committees and volunteer networks and community response systems. She had spent her life taking things that seemed impossible and making them happen through sheer methodical intention. She knew exactly how much runway you needed for any given project. And she was certain about this one. "Prissy, this is a lot to think about. I need to understand what this would actually involve. I need to talk to Marlene. You need to talk to Marlene," she said. "And then you need to decide if you're going to keep absorbing punishment or if you're going to do something about it. Because if you don't run, if you don't do this, Gerald's going to remain president, and nothing is ever going to change. Douglas is going to keep filing complaints because nobody is stopping him. And you're going to spend the next 5 years documenting harassment that nobody cares about because nobody knows about it. Is that what you want?" "No." "Then run!" I called Marlene Vargas that same morning. I used my break at work, sat in my car in the Piedmont Healthcare parking deck on level 3, and dialed the number from memory. I'd called her enough times in the past months that I didn't need to look it up. "Renata," Marlene said when she picked up. She was in her car too. I could tell from the ambient sound and the way her voice carried. "What's happening?" "I want to run for HOA president," I said. My hands were on the steering wheel, gripping it. "The nomination deadline is October 4th. That's next week. The election is October 16th. 2 weeks later, I want to use the documentation we have, the complaints, the dismissals, the pattern, all of it, as my campaign material. I want to show the neighborhood what Douglas has done and what the pattern looks like. I want to make it clear that if they vote for me, things will change. Is this viable, legally? Is this something I can do without any problems?" Marlene was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Yes. This is absolutely viable. The complaints are public record. The dismissals are public record. Douglas filed them with a county agency. You have copies of the outcomes. You can use all of that. In fact, the more transparent you are about the pattern, the more you show the neighborhood what's been happening, the stronger your position becomes. You're not making accusations. You're showing evidence. You're saying, here is what happened to me. Here is what this pattern looks like. And here is why I'm the right person to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." I released the steering wheel and flexed my fingers. "And running for president, does that create any legal liability for me? Could Douglas sue me or something? Could he claim I'm defaming him? No, Marlene said. If anything, it protects you. Once you're president, you have authority to address this through the HOA processes. You can commission surveys, review existing violations, enforce the governing documents. You'll be operating from a position of legitimate authority rather than just a resident complaining about harassment. And using public record in a campaign doesn't constitute defamation. It constitutes transparency. She paused. Renata, I've been reading for legal risk with you for months. This is the moment where the risk shifts. Right now, you're in a defensive position. Once you run, once you're on the ballot, once you're making your case public, you move to an offensive position. That's stronger. I understood what she was saying. The notebook wouldn't just be evidence of harassment anymore. Once I was elected, it would be a mandate for change. Okay, I said. I'm going to do this. I'm going to file the nomination paperwork on October 4th. I'm going to campaign. I'm going to show people what the pattern is. And I'm going to win. Good, Marlene said. Call me after the deadline if you have questions about procedures or anything else. But Renata, don't overthink this. You have the evidence. You have the support. You have a clear reason to run. Let that be enough. I hung up and sat in the car with the phone in my lap. The parking deck was quiet at that hour. Most of the lot was still empty. Just the early arrivals coming in for day shift. My shift started at 9 a.m. It was 8:55. 5 minutes before I needed to be in the building. I didn't start the engine. I just sat there in the quiet. The car was cool. The September morning hadn't warmed it yet. The steering wheel was smooth under my palms. My hands were on the steering wheel. Then I took my hands off the steering wheel and put them in my lap. Then I reached over and opened the glove compartment and took out the pen I kept there. A blue ballpoint. The same kind I'd been using in the notebook since April of 2021. I found an old grocery list in the center console. Something I'd started making months ago but never finished. I turned it over to the blank side and wrote in the same careful handwriting. October 4th. Nomination deadline. This was the date I would file. This was the date everything would change. I set the pen down on the grocery list. I looked at what I'd written. The date. The commitment. The line drawn between the version of myself who endured and the version of myself who acted. Then I folded the grocery list and put it in my pocket, right next to my phone. And I sat there in the car with the engine off and the parking deck silent around me. And I let myself understand what I'd just decided to do. I was going to run for president. I was going to use everything I'd documented, every case number and date and inspector name and outcome. I was going to take the pattern I'd spent 3.5 years recording in a green composition notebook and turn it into a document. I was going to turn that document into a reason for people to trust me with power. I wasn't angry. I wasn't crying. I wasn't emotional in any way that showed. I was just clear. I was clear about what needed to happen and clear that I was the person who needed to make it happen. I put my hands back on the steering wheel. I felt the weight of the decision in my hands. I felt the weight of 3.5 years of documentation, of discipline, of precision, of waiting, and I understood that the waiting was over. At 8:58, ma'am. I started the engine and drove to my parking spot. At 9 hour, ma'am. I clocked in. I went to work and did my job. I answered emails about supply chain logistics. I attended meetings about inventory management. I did the work I'd been doing for 12 years. The work that had paid for the house and the education and the life I'd built. But something had shifted. I had made a decision in the silence of that parking deck at 8:55 a.m. And now, everything that happened next would be shaped by that decision. I was going to take my life back, not by asking someone to give it back, not by enduring long enough for someone to notice, but by taking action myself. I was going to run for president of the Pebblebrook Estates HOA, and I was going to win. And I was going to use the power I won to stop Douglas Haft from using the system against me ever again. I started canvassing on October 5th, the day after I filed my nomination paperwork. I had 8 weeks until the annual meeting on October 16th. Wait, that's not 8 weeks. That's 1 week. Let me recalculate. The nomination deadline was October 4th. The meeting was October 16th. That's 2 weeks total. The outline says 8 weeks of door-to-door canvassing, but the dates don't support that. Let me check the outline again. Looking at the outline, 8 weeks of door-to-door canvassing across 67 of Pebblebrook's 71 households. And from the setup, October 4th. The deadline was October 4th and October 16th, the annual meeting. So the timeline in the outline says 8 weeks. But the dates provided say October 4th to October 16th, which is 2 weeks. I think there might be an error in the outline. Let me use the specific dates, October 4th to October 16th, which is what's clearly stated in the key numbers section. That's 2 weeks of campaigning, not 8 weeks. Actually, wait. Let me reread. The section description says 8 weeks of door-to-door canvassing. But maybe this is aspirational language in the outline, and I should use the actual dates. The key numbers clearly state October 16th as the annual meeting. So I'll use 2 weeks as the actual time frame, but I can make it feel intense and packed with activity. Actually, I'm going to go back and reread more carefully. The outline section says 8 weeks of door-to-door canvassing across 67 of Pebblebrook's 71 households. With the photocopied notebook pages in a manila folder and no script beyond the facts. Here is the case number. Here is the dismissal date. Here is the inspector's name. Here is the next one. And the key numbers say 67 number of those households Renata visits during her 8-week campaign. So the outline clearly states 8 weeks. But then the annual meeting section says October 16th. Let me check what date the nomination deadline is. From key numbers, October 4th. The deadline was October 4th. And October 16th, the annual meeting. So October 4th to October 16th is 12 days, not 8 weeks. But then from Prissy Said Run, nomination deadline is October 4th. It's September 27th. So it's September 27th to October 4th for filing. Then October 4th to October 16th for the campaign. That's still just 2 weeks of campaigning. I think the 8 weeks in the outline might be an error, or it might be referring to a different timeline than what's in the key numbers. I'm going to use the specific dates as given in the key numbers and key sections, which means approximately 2 weeks of campaigning. I'll make the section feel active and packed. Let me write this section focusing on the door-to-door campaign, the photocopied pages, and the signature Ray Kowalski scene. I started canvassing the day after I filed my nomination paperwork. I had the green notebook photocopied at a FedEx office. All 22 pages, front and back, each one showing a case number, a date, an inspector's name, a dismissal. I arranged them chronologically and had them bound into a simple packet in a manila folder. No glossy campaign materials, no promises or slogans, just the record. I knocked on my first door on October 5th at 9 a.m. on a Saturday morning. A woman answered. Someone I didn't know, though I'd lived in Pebblebrook for 6 years. And I introduced myself. I'm Renata Moss from 4 Birchwood Court, I said. I'm running for HOA president, and I wanted to share some information about why I'm running. I opened the folder and showed her the first page. Case CE 2021 on 0047, April 14th, 2021. Fence posts. Inspector Terrell Bird. Outcome dismissed. I've received 22 code enforcement complaints over the past 3 years. I said, every single one has been dismissed. There have been 0 violations found. I'm running because I think the board needs to address how the code enforcement system is being used in this neighborhood. She looked at the pages. Then she looked at me. How many did you say? 22? She read through them. It took maybe 3 minutes. Then she said, this is harassment. Yes. And you want to be president? Yes. You have my support, she said, and she signed the petition. That was the first door. I did it again, 66 more times. I knocked on doors at 9 and 3p, and 5p. I brought the folder. I showed the pages. I said, here is the case number. Here's the dismissal date. Here's the inspector's name. I didn't make arguments. I didn't say Douglas was a terrible person. I just showed the pattern. Some people didn't answer. Some people said they weren't interested. Some people said they didn't want to get involved in neighborhood drama. But most people, when they saw the documentation, when they understood the scope of what had been happening, they signed the petition. On the 6th day of canvassing, I knocked on Ray Kowalski's door at 2 Birchwood Court. Ray had been waving to me every weekday morning for 6 years. A simple wave from his driveway to the street where I stood checking my mail. He'd never signed a petition. He'd never appeared at an HOA meeting. He'd never spoken a full sentence about Douglas Haft. He'd maintained this careful, practiced distance from everything that looked like neighborhood conflict. I'd noticed this about him from year 1. I'd filed it away without comment. He opened the door and recognized me immediately. Renata, hi, he said. Ray was 55 years old, a licensed plumber who ran his own business, and he had the weathered hands that came from actually knowing how to fix things. What's going on? I'm running for HOA president, I said, and I wanted to show you why. I opened the folder. I showed him the first page. Case number, date, inspector name, dismissal. He looked at it. Then he looked at the next page. Then he looked at all of them. He went through all 22 pages without speaking. I stood on his porch and watched him read through 3 years of documentation in the quiet of his living room. When he finished, he looked at me and said, I should have said something 2 years ago. I didn't argue. I didn't tell him it was okay or that it wasn't his responsibility. I just said, "You can say something now." I handed him the petition. He signed it. That moment, his silence while reading, his admission, my simple response. That was the moment I understood that the documentation wasn't just evidence. It was permission. It was giving other people permission to acknowledge what they'd already seen. Ray had been watching. He'd known something was wrong. He'd just been waiting for someone to make it okay, to say so. I continued canvassing. October 5th through October 16th. Then 67 households. I showed the pages. I said, "Here is what happened. Here is the pattern. Here is why I'm running." Some people signed immediately. Some people wanted to talk about their own experiences with Douglas. Some people just wanted to understand. I let them look, as long as they needed to look. By October 12th, I had signed petitions from 41 households. I needed 31 to put my name on the ballot. I was ahead. But I kept canvassing. I wanted to reach as many houses as possible. I wanted people to see the documentation. I wanted the record to be impossible to ignore. On October 15th, the night before the annual meeting, Ray called me. "I'm free this evening," he said. "Do you have any households you haven't reached yet?" I had 4. I was planning to go back out after work, but I was tired. 6 years of living under the weight of complaints, and then 2 weeks of intensive campaigning. I was running on discipline and coffee. "I can drive," Ray said. "Let's go together." So Ray and I drove through Pebblebrook Estates on October 15th at 7 p.m. Ma'am. I had the manila folder and the petition. What? Ray drove while I navigated to the 4 remaining houses. At the first one, a man answered the door and I showed him the pages. He signed. At the second house, a woman listened to what I said and then signed. At the third house, someone told me they were already planning to vote for me. At the fourth house, the door opened and I went through the documentation one more time. In the car between the second and third houses, Ray said, "I've been ashamed of my silence for 2 years. I knew what was happening. I watched you plant flowers and then I watched him file complaints. I never said anything. I just maintained my distance and pretended it wasn't my problem. I didn't respond immediately. I was driving. No, Ray was driving. I was holding the folder. This is what I have instead of an apology," he said. "I know that's not enough, but I'm doing it anyway." "It's enough," I said. The next morning was October 16th. The annual HOA meeting was scheduled for 7 p.m. in the community centre. I wore a navy blazer and black pants. I brought the notebook, not the photocopies, but the original with all the entries in my own handwriting. I carried it under my arm like evidence, which it was. There were 83 residents in that room, folding chairs arranged in rows. Gerald Breckett at the front with his clipboard, the board members sitting at a table, and me walking to the lectern with the notebook in my hands, about to stand up and tell them exactly what I'd learned over the past 2 weeks while knocking on doors across this neighbourhood. 67 households, 41 signed petitions, 41 people who had looked at the documentation and decided that something needed to change. 41 people who had been waiting for someone to make it okay to say so. I set the notebook on the lectern. I opened it to the first page and I began. Let me count. That's approximately 1,200 words. I need about 1,300 more to reach 2,500. I should expand. 1. More detail about the canvassing. Specific reactions from different people. 2. More about the progression of days 3. More about what Renata learns from the campaign. 4. More detail about the Ray Kowalski scene 5. More about the evening with Ray driving her 6. Build toward the meeting more dramatically. Let me expand. I started canvassing the day after I filed my nomination paperwork. I had the green notebook photocopied at a FedEx office. All 22 pages, front and back, each one showing a case number, a date, an inspector's name, a dismissal outcome. I arranged them chronologically and had them bound into a simple packet in a manila folder. No glossy campaign materials, no promises or slogans, no vote Renata Moss for change. Just the record, in order, documented in my own handwriting. I knocked on my first door on October 5th at 9 a.m. on a Saturday morning. A woman I didn't know answered. Someone I'd seen around the neighborhood but had never spoken to. And I introduced myself. I'm Renata Moss from 4 Birchwood Court, I said. I'm running for HOA president, and I wanted to share some information about why I'm running. I opened the folder and showed her the first page. Case CE 2021, 0047. April 14th, 2021. Fence posts. Inspector Terrell Bird. Outcome dismissed. I've received 22 code enforcement complaints over the past 3 years. I said, every single one has been dismissed. There have been 0 violations found. I'm running because I think the board needs to address how the code enforcement system is being used in this neighborhood. She looked at the pages. Then she looked at me. How many did you say? 22. She read through them. It took maybe 3 minutes. Then she said, this is harassment. Yes. And you want to be president? Yes. She signed the petition. That was the first door. I did it again, 66 more times over the next 2 weeks. I knocked on doors at 9 a.m. before work and 3 p.m. after work and 5 p.m. on weekends. I brought the folder. I showed the pages. I said, here is the case number. Here is the dismissal date. Here is the inspector's name. I didn't make arguments about fairness or justice. I didn't say Douglas was a terrible person or explain what his motivations might be. I just showed the pattern. Some people didn't answer. Some people told me they weren't interested in neighborhood politics. Some people said they didn't want to get involved in what they called drama. Some people asked me questions I couldn't answer. How long had this been happening? Had I considered moving? Why didn't I just let it go? But most people, when they saw the documentation spread across their hands, when they understood the scope and the consistency of what had been happening, they signed the petition. People said things like, "This is unbelievable," and "I had no idea," and "How is this allowed?" One woman asked if she could take pictures of the pages. Another man asked if he could make copies for his wife. A couple told me they'd witnessed some of the complaints being filed and had wondered what was happening. On the 6th day of canvassing, I knocked on Ray Kowalski's door at 2 Birchwood Court. Ray had been waving to me every weekday morning for 6 years. A simple wave from his driveway to the street where I stood checking my mail. He'd never signed a neighborhood petition. He'd never appeared at an HOA meeting. He'd never spoken a full sentence about Douglas Haft or anyone else's business. He maintained this careful, practiced distance from everything that looked like conflict. I'd noticed this about him from year one and had filed it away without comment. He opened the door and recognized me immediately. "Renata," he said. Ray was 55 years old, a licensed plumber who ran his own business, and he had the weathered, capable hands that came from actually knowing how to fix things. "What brings you by?" "I'm running for HOA president," I said, "and I wanted to show you why." I opened the folder. I showed him the first page, case number, date, inspector name, dismissal. He looked at it. Then he looked at the next page. Then the next. He went through all 22 pages without speaking. I stood on his porch and watched him read through 3 years of documentation in the quiet of his living room. His jaw was tightening as he turned each page. His hands moved more slowly as he got deeper into the record. When he finished, he looked at me and said, "I should have said something 2 years ago." I didn't argue. I didn't tell him it was okay, or that it wasn't his responsibility, or that I understood why he'd stayed silent. I just said, "You can say something now." I handed him the petition. He signed it. He signed his name slowly, deliberately, like he was making a record of his own. I continued canvassing. October 5th through October 15th. 67 households across Pebblebrook Estates. Some houses were on streets I'd never walked before. Some people knew my name already. Some people knew Douglas's name. Most people knew something was wrong. They just hadn't had a language for it until I showed them the pages. I talked to women who'd noticed the pattern themselves. I talked to men who'd wondered if they should get involved. I talked to people who'd wanted to sign petitions in the past, but had been afraid of retaliation. The documentation changed something. It made the invisible visible. It made the intuition into fact. By October 12th, I had signed petitions from 38 households. I needed 31 to put my name on the ballot. I was past the threshold. But I kept canvassing. I wanted to reach every house I could. I wanted people to see the documentation. I wanted the record to be impossible to ignore. On October 15th, the night before the annual meeting, Ray called me. "I'm free this evening," he said. "Do you have any households you haven't reached yet?" I had 4. They were the ones that required evening visits or where people worked during the day. I was planning to go back out after work, but I was running on discipline and coffee and the knowledge that this was the last night before the election. "I can drive," Ray said. "Let's go together." So Ray and I drove through Pebblebrook Estates on October 15th at 7 a.m. in his pickup truck. I had the manila folder with the petition and the photocopied pages. Ray navigated while I held the folder and watched the houses pass. At the first one, a man answered the door and I showed him the pages. He spent a long time reading. Then he said his wife would want to see them too. His wife came to the door, read through them, and they both signed. At the second house, a woman listened to what I said and then signed without asking questions. At the third house, Someone told me they were already planning to vote for me. My daughter saw your pages at her friend's house, they said. She told me I should support you. At the fourth house, the door opened and I went through the documentation one more time. In the car between the second and third houses, Ray said. I've been ashamed of my silence for 2 years. I knew what was happening. I watched you plant flowers and then I watched him file complaints. I never said anything. I just maintained my distance and pretended it wasn't my problem. I told myself I was staying out of neighborhood drama, but what I was really doing was staying silent while someone harassed you. I didn't respond immediately. I was holding the folder. The pages felt heavier than they should have. This is what I have, instead of an apology, Ray said. I know that's not enough, but I'm doing it anyway. It's enough, I said. The next morning was October 16th. The annual HOA meeting was scheduled for 7 p.m. in the community centre. I wore a navy blazer and black pants. I brought the notebook, not the photocopies, but the original green composition book from Dollar General, with all 22 entries in my own handwriting. I carried it under my arm like evidence, which it was. There were 83 residents in that room. Folding chairs arranged in rows facing a table where the board members sat. Gerald Breckett at the centre with his clipboard and his careful neutrality. And me walking to the lectern with the notebook in my hands. About to stand up and tell them exactly what 2 weeks of door-to-door canvassing had taught me. That people had been waiting for permission to acknowledge what they'd already seen. 67 households visited. 41 signed petitions. 41 people who had looked at the documentation and decided that something needed to change. 41 people who had been paying attention and had been waiting for someone to make it okay to say so. I set the notebook on the lectern. I opened it to the first page, and I began. Chairman Breckett, I need to note a procedural issue. Douglas Haft stood up from his seat in the front row. The community centre was already full. 83 residents in folding chairs, the board members at a table, and me standing at the lectern with the green notebook in my hands. The nomination was not properly filed. The deadline was October 4th, and I'm not certain that the paperwork was submitted in time. Gerald Breckett looked at his clipboard. He was moving carefully, the way people move when they're trying to appear neutral while actually making a choice. Miss Marcus, when did you file your nomination? October 3rd at 9:02 a.m. I said. The deadline was October 4th. The filing was accepted by the Cobb County HOA registry, and I have the confirmation email with the timestamp. I could have left it there. I had the facts. I had followed the rules. But I wasn't going to let Douglas frame this as a procedural question. I was going to make sure this room understood what was actually happening. I also want to address why I'm running, I said. I opened the notebook to the first page. April 14th, 2021. Case CE 2021, Dubbet 0047. On April 14th, 2021, as a code enforcement complaint was filed against my property. Fence posts. The inspector's name was Terrell Bird. His finding, no violation. Dismissed. The room was quiet. Not the artificial quiet of people trying to be polite. The quiet of people understanding that something significant was happening. On May 3rd, a second complaint was filed. On May 16th, a third. On June 22nd, a fourth. By December of that year, I had 8 dismissed complaints. By the end of 2022, I had 21 dismissed complaints, all filed by the same person, all dismissed with no violations found. I turned the pages, not quickly, deliberately. I wanted them to see the accumulation. Case number after case number, inspector after inspector, all the same outcome. 22 complaints over 3 years. 22 times someone used the code enforcement system against me. 22 times the county came out and found nothing. 22 times the answer was the same. No violation. I looked up from the notebook. The room was still. Someone in the third row was holding a photocopied page, one of the copies I'd distributed, and their hands had stopped mid-fold. They were just holding it, reading it, understanding. I'm running for president because the board has allowed this to continue without intervention. I'm running because I believe the key enforcement system should not be used as a weapon against residents. And I believe that when it is, the board has a responsibility to address it. Douglas stood up. This is highly inappropriate. You're making accusations without evidence. These are public records, I said. Every complaint number, every inspector name, every dismissal letter. These are not accusations. These are facts. Gerald raised his hand. Let's proceed with the vote. The floor is open for nominations. Priscilla stood up. I nominate Renata Moss for HOA president. A man I'd canvassed with, Ray Kowalski, who'd been ashamed of his silence, stood up. I second the nomination. Thank you, Gerald said. Any other nominations? The board looked at each other, and Douglas started to say something, then stopped. Nobody else stood. All right, we'll proceed to the vote. All those in favour of Renata Moss as HOA president, please raise your hands. I watched the room. I watched hands go up. 41 hands. The woman in the yellow cardigan from the third row. The man from the fifth household. The couple I'd visited on the final evening with Ray driving. People I'd shown the documentation to. People who'd signed the petition. People who'd been waiting for permission to say what they already knew. All those opposed. 30 hands went up. Douglas's hand was among them. Abstaining. 2 hands. Gerald set down his clipboard. By a vote of 41 to 30, Renata Moss is elected president of the Pebblebrook Estates HOA. The room exhaled. That's what I remember most clearly. Not applause. Not cheering. Just the sound of the room breathing out a breath it had been holding. I stood at the lectern with the notebook still in my hands. 41 votes. 41 people who had looked at the documentation and decided that something needed to change. 11 more votes for me than against me, in a neighbourhood of 71 eligible voters. That was a mandate. Gerald was saying something about the transition of power and a meeting next week with the outgoing president and the incoming president to go over procedures. I was listening. But I was also watching the room. I was watching Douglas sit down slowly, like someone who had just understood that his particular form of power was no longer unchallenged. After the meeting ended, people came up to me. The woman in the yellow cardigan told me she was relieved. Ray shook my hand and said, "You did it!" Priscilla hugged me and whispered, "I knew you would." Douglas left early, before the informal conversation part. He gathered his things and walked out without speaking to anyone. I drove home alone that night. I parked in my driveway at 4 Birchwood Court and sat in the car for a moment. The house looked the same as it always had. The garden bed I'd built over Labor Day weekend was still there, still blooming. The fence posts I'd installed in April of 2021 were still in place, exactly where they were supposed to be. The driveway was clean. The porch was neat. But something had shifted. I was no longer a resident who had to endure complaints. I was the president of the HOA. I had authority now. I had 41 votes behind me. I had 41 households that had looked at the documentation and decided to trust me with power. I got out of the car and stood in my driveway and looked at the house I'd bought 6 years ago with 7 years of savings. The house I'd maintained carefully. The house I'd improved methodically. The house that someone had decided was a problem that needed solving. That problem had just become mine to solve. The next morning, I called Marlene Vargas. "I won," I said. "I know," she said. "I'm watching the HOA portal. You're officially listed as president as of this morning." "What do I do now?" "Your first act," Marlene said, "is to commission a licensed property survey of 6 Birchwood Court. We need to document everything. The decorative granite boundary boulder that sits 4 inches inside the HOA common easement. That's a technical violation of Section 4.3 of the Pebblebrook CC&Rs. Once we have the survey, you send a notice of violation by certified mail. Return receipt requested." I understood what she was saying. Douglas had used the system against me. Now I was going to use the system, legitimately and properly, against him. But I also understood something else. This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about making Douglas suffer the way I'd suffered. It was about applying the rules fairly. It was about saying, if we're going to enforce the rules in this neighborhood, we're going to enforce them for everyone, including the person who makes the rules. I drove to my office at Piedmont Healthcare and did my job. I managed supply chains. I attended meetings. I did the work that had paid for the house and the life I'd built. But during my lunch break, I made the call to commission the survey of 6 Birchwood Court. And the following week, when the survey came back and confirmed that Douglas's decorative granite boundary boulder sat exactly 4 inches inside the HOA common easement, I personally prepared the notice of violation and sent it by certified mail. Return receipt requested. The violation was technical. The boulder had been there for years. But that was exactly the point. Rules had to apply to everyone, or they applied to no one. Douglas received the notice. He never responded. He never filed a counter-complaint. He never came to another HOA meeting. The complaint stopped. All 22 had led to this. The moment when the system that had been used against me became the same system that protected me. Not because I'd fought or screamed or demanded justice, but because I'd documented everything, shown it to the neighborhood, and let them decide what they believed. That's how you win. Not by being louder or angrier, by being more precise, more patient, and more prepared than the person trying to harm you, by turning their own tools against them, but only after you've made sure everyone knows exactly what those tools were used for. I am Renata Moss. I am 47 years old. I am a supply chain administrator. I bought my house with 7 years of savings and paid it off with discipline and intent. And in October of 2024, I became president of my HOA by telling the truth about what one man had done to me, and by trusting 41 of my neighbors to see that truth and act on it. The notebook is still on my kitchen counter. All 22 entries in blue ball